When I decided to move to Rockford, a small and forgotten town in the middle of nowhere, I didn't expect to find much beyond silence and tranquility. After years of living in the chaos of big cities, all I wanted was a place where I could finally have some peace. My remote job allowed me that freedom, and the price of houses was incredibly low, so I didn't hesitate to buy a modest but cozy property on the outskirts of town. The plan was simple: calm days, silent nights, and a life without surprises. Rockford was a peculiar place. Despite being far from any major highway and having nothing but a small grocery store, a pharmacy, and a rundown bar in the center, the residents seemed content with their monotonous routine. The town had just over 500 inhabitants, all of whom knew each other, and if you were new, you quickly became the object of curious looks. On my first day, I went to the grocery store to buy supplies, and the cashier, an elderly woman named Mabel, didn't hesitate to ask where I was from and what I was doing there. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested caution, as if she was trying to assess whether I was someone who should be there. The other residents shared that same subtle strangeness. They weren't hostile, far from it. On the contrary, everyone greeted me politely, but their interactions felt rehearsed, like etiquette rules that had to be followed. They never spent too much time talking, never asked overly deep questions. It was as if there was an unspoken understanding among them about how far curiosity could go. The town, it seemed, had its own codes. Over time, I started noticing other peculiarities. The streets were practically deserted after dark. No children played outside after 6 in the evening. The houses kept their curtains closed, and almost every window had heavy internal locks. This could be explained as just a small-town habit where people went to bed early, but there was something unsettling about the way silence took over the place. It was a dense, suffocating silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath after nightfall. By my third week in Rockford, something even stranger started happening. I had always been a heavy sleeper, but that night I woke up to a peculiar noise outside, a soft sound, like bare feet stepping on damp earth. My bedroom was on the second floor of the house, and the window overlooked a small trail leading into the woods behind the town. By reflex, I looked out the glass, expecting to see an animal or perhaps a late-night resident heading home. But what I saw was something entirely different. Footprints had appeared on the ground below my window, long trails of footprints, as if someone had been walking in circles there for a long time. The problem was that the marks were directly beneath my window, and the only way someone could have left them there was if they had been standing still, watching me. The thought sent a chill down my spine. The next day, I mentioned the incident to one of my neighbors, an old man named Thomas who always sat on his porch, smoking an old pipe. He was one of the few who seemed willing to exchange more than a few words. When I told him about the footprints, his expression hardened, and he simply shook his head, as if he already knew exactly what I was talking about. "Keep your curtains closed, son," he said without looking directly at me. "And if you hear anything at night, ignore it. Don't look outside. Just stay where you are and wait for morning." I tried to insist, to ask what he knew, but Thomas shut down. He pretended the conversation was over and went back to smoking his pipe as if nothing had happened. But I wasn't convinced. On the contrary, my curiosity only grew. Something was happening in that town, something everyone knew but no one talked about. The following night, I prepared myself. I closed all the curtains but left a small gap open, just enough to peek through without being noticed. I waited until the silence took over the town again and lay in bed, listening. Then, a little past midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, the sound seemed closer. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and slowly approached the window. When I looked through the gap, my heart nearly stopped. There, in the middle of the empty street, stood a silhouette. I couldn't make out any details, only a dark figure, motionless, staring in the direction of my house. Swallowing hard, I stepped back slightly, trying to keep my breathing steady. When I looked again, the figure was gone. But the footprints had multiplied. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, a strange anxiety I couldn't explain. The memory of the figure in the street, of the footprints that seemed to multiply with each passing moment was still fresh in my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, maybe old footprints I hadn't noticed before. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The day dragged on. I tried to distract myself with work, but I couldn't focus. I decided to leave the house and walk to Mabel's grocery store, hoping to clear my mind. On the way, I noticed that the townspeople's stares were more intense than usual. They seemed to know that I had seen something, as if they could sense my unease. No one said anything directly, but the way they averted their eyes or whispered after I passed spoke volumes. Mabel was the only one who looked at me directly. When I went to pay for my groceries, she held my hand for a second longer than necessary. In a low, cautious tone, murmured, "You saw it, didn't you?" I hesitated but gave a slight nod. Her eyes narrowed and she let out a heavy sigh. "You'd better leave while you still can, boy, before it's too late." "What's happening?" I asked, trying to control the tremor in my voice. She just shook her head and pushed my groceries toward me. She said nothing more. I returned home with my stomach in knots. Something was wrong in this town, and now I was sure that everyone knew it. But why wouldn't they talk about it openly? Why had they let me move here without warning? That night, I locked all the doors and windows. I shut the curtains completely. But none of it eased the feeling that something was watching me. I sat on my bed, listening to the absolute silence of the town. Then the footsteps began again. This time, they were louder, closer. They seemed to be coming from my backyard. My heart pounded faster, my breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera, aiming the lens at the small gap between the curtains. The screen showed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints weren't just on the ground. They were climbing up the wall of my house. I threw the phone aside and backed away from the window, trying to process what I had just seen. This didn't make sense. None of this made sense. And then something even worse happened. My bedroom door opened on its own. I froze. The door creaked slowly, revealing the darkness of the hallway. My eyes locked onto the void beyond. Something was there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A cold wind blew through the room, making my skin prickle. The lights began to flicker. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then, from the darkness of the hallway, I heard a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." My mind went into panic. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the door. There was nothing there, just an empty, terrifying void. Breathing heavily, I forced myself to stand and rush to the door, slamming it shut and locking it with everything I could. I pressed my back against the wood, feeling my heart about to burst out of my chest. The night dragged on. I sat on my bed, clutching a pocket knife I had brought from the city, as if it could protect me from something I couldn't even understand. The footsteps continued outside, and with each passing hour, they seemed to multiply. More footprints, more voices. The next morning, I found something that made me take an immediate decision. When I finally gathered the courage to leave my room, I saw that all the walls of the house were covered in handprints. They were small, like a child's hands, but stained with something dark, like soot or dried blood. They were everywhere. This wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. I needed to leave Rockford, and I had to do it before nightfall. The night dragged on, and I didn't sleep a single second. The wind howled outside, and the footsteps continued, even after the sun began to rise on the horizon. When I finally dared to leave my room, my house felt even colder and stranger than the night before. The handprints remained, dry and ominous, as if they had become part of the house itself. I had to get out of there, but before leaving, I decided to talk to someone. I needed answers. The only person who came to mind was old Thomas, the town's oldest resident, a man who rarely left his small wooden house near the main square. If anyone knew what was going on, it would be him. I found Thomas sitting on his porch, smoking a pipe and watching the empty street. When I approached, he lifted his tired eyes and studied me for a long moment before speaking. "I see it in your eyes, boy. You want to ask something, don't you?" I swallowed hard and sat in the chair next to him. "What's happening here, Thomas? I know something's wrong. Last night," I hesitated, feeling a shiver run down my spine at the memory of the footprints, the voices, and the door that had opened on its own. I saw things, I heard things. He took a slow drag from his pipe, as if carefully choosing his words before responding. "Listen, kid," he said bluntly. "Don't try to understand. Don't try to make sense of it. Just go on with your life. Ignore what you must. Live in peace." His tone was firm, but there was something in his eyes, something tense, like he wanted to say more, but was trapped by something far greater than himself. "But Thomas," I tried to insist, but he raised his hand and cut me off. "Don't ask anything else. Just go home and forget. This town has its ways. It always has, and it always will." The coldness of his words unsettled me. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening but refused to speak about it, as if silence was his only way to survive. I left Thomas's house more confused than when I had arrived, but what unsettled me the most was something I overheard while passing a small group of townspeople in the square. They were speaking in hushed tones, but for a brief moment, I caught a whisper among them. "It's time." My body went cold. What did that mean? Time for what? I quickened my pace and returned home, trying to ignore the way the townspeople watched me as I passed. The entire town seemed to breathe a heavy secret, a mystery I was increasingly certain I didn't want to uncover. That night, terror gripped me in a way I had never experienced before. I tried to follow old Thomas's advice and ignore what was happening, but it was impossible. Something or someone was determined to get me out of there, or to drive me insane. The whispers began shortly after nightfall. Distorted voices echoed throughout the house, coming from all directions. Some words were clear, others were just unintelligible murmurs, filled with desperation and urgency. "Leave," the voices hissed. The temperature dropped drastically. My breath turned to mist in the air, and my bones felt frozen from the inside. That was when I heard the first knocks on the door. 3 dry knocks, followed by a deathly silence. Trembling, I walked slowly to the door, clutching a knife in my shaky hand. I looked through the peephole, and nothing, just the darkness of the night. But as I stepped back, the knocking returned, this time louder, more urgent. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there. Without thinking twice, I ran to my room, threw some clothes and personal belongings into a backpack, and grabbed my car keys. The house shook with a thunderclap that rattled the windows, and at that moment, I felt it. Something was inside with me. The lights flickered frantically. The whispers turned into muffled screams. The entire room seemed to shrink around me. When I looked into the mirror, I saw dark silhouettes surrounding me, shadows writhing, stretching their spectral hands toward me. That was enough. I bolted for the front door and threw it open. The night air was heavy, dense like tar, but I didn't care. I ran to my car, locking the doors the moment I sat in the driver's seat. The engine struggled to start, every second feeling like an eternity. When the car finally roared to life, I looked in the rearview mirror. The shadows were all gathered at my front door, watching me in silence. Their faces were indistinct, but their intent was clear. They wanted me. I pressed the accelerator and got out of there as fast as I could. The streets were deserted, but I could feel eyes watching me from every house. The streetlights flickered as I passed, and in my mind, the whispers echoed, "Get out of here." I left the town without looking back. Days passed on the road until I finally found a safe place. My body was exhausted, my mind shattered. I didn't know what had happened in Rockford, but I felt like I had escaped by a thread. I checked into a cheap motel, trying to piece my thoughts together. It was on the 3rd night away that I saw the news on TV. Small town of Rockford exposed as the site of macabre rituals and serial murders. Authorities uncovered decades of human sacrifices and dark rituals. Town residents were involved in the crimes, led by Thomas Carver, the town elder. My heart stopped. The screen showed images of the town I knew so well. Quiet streets, wooden houses, Mabel's little grocery store. But now, everything was surrounded by police tape. The expressions of the few captured survivors were cold, empty. Thomas, handcuffed, held the same look he had given me the day I tried to question him. The reporter continued. Thomas's preferred victims were mostly new male residents. The townspeople were prepared to attack the owner of this house. The footage then showed what had once been my home. That was when the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The shadows, the voices, the footprints, they weren't threats, they were warnings. They were the souls of the victims trying to save me, and I had almost ignored them. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.